Well, today we're going to start talking about the general approach to philosophy known as empiricism. The central idea is that knowledge comes from experience. Now, explaining how our knowledge of the world around us comes from sensory experience is in some cases very easy. That there's a table in the room, for example, is something we might discover through sight, through touch. That there is basil growing in my front yard is something you might see, you might learn through touch, you might learn through the sense of smell. Lots of things are easy to account for on an empiricist model. But some things are not so easy. And one of the things that is classically not very easy is something really central to philosophy, namely ethics. How do we recognize something as good or bad, as right or wrong, just or unjust, virtuous or vicious? That's something that isn't just easy to read off by looking at something, or by hearing it, or by smelling it, or touching it, and so on. And so the empiricist has to give us a story about how ethics is possible, how value, in short, gets into the world. And we're going to start with Confucius, partly because he does that. He tries to give us an account of what's, not only how moral knowledge is possible, but really gives us a general outline of what an ethical theory should look like. So, who is Confucius? He's somebody who is probably the most revered person in the history of China, somebody who had as many as 3,000 students at a time. He was himself quite modest in his behavior and in his speech. He married young. The highest position he ever attained was becoming a master of a granary, and nevertheless he became enormously influential. Now, why are we looking at Confucius? Well, really for two reasons. One is that he does give us a very clear idea of what the structure of ethics should be like in general. It seems to me that whether you like his particular theory or not, whether you're an empiricist in your approach to knowledge or not, he tells you what an ethical theory should look like. And that's going to be valuable to us all the way through the course, no matter what kind of approach we end up taking. Whatever you think the answers to the questions of ethics ought to be, he gives us a very clear account of what the questions are. Now, the second thing that I think is really valuable about Confucius is that he does give us a theory of ethics, and it's unique in some ways. Even in the empiricist tradition, it's rather unique. He gives us a theory that is based on social roles, on one that's based on relationships. Most other people give us a theory that is based on reason, let's say, or on emotion, or on pleasure and pain, or on a variety of other things that are much more abstract. But Confucius says, look, I cannot judge your actions in relation to me apart from knowing something about our social relationship. My obligations to you are different depending on whether you're a complete stranger, whether you're a student of mine, whether you are my own son or daughter, and so on. And so it matters what kind of relationship we stand in to people to determine what's good behavior and what's bad behavior, what the norms that ought to govern our relationship ought to be. Now, strangely, I think, most people in the West have utterly ignored that aspect of ethics. In fact, a few years ago, I was asked to give a talk on Father's Day about what Western philosophers had to say about fathers. And I said, look, I can't do it, because I can tell you right now, they've said nothing about fathers. They've really said nothing about mothers. They've said nothing about relationships within the family or other kinds of specific relationships. They just talk about relations between people in general. And so really you have to go outside the Western tradition to get an account that takes those kinds of relationships very seriously. Well, let's get to that first point. What is the structure of an ethical theory? How should Confucius, or anyone looking at questions of ethics, begin to think about it? He says, really, any ethical theory has to answer three questions. The first question is, what kind of person should I be? Sorry. Wonder where's his microphone in a better spot? First of all, there. What kind of person should I be? That's something that is a very general sort of question. It has nothing to do directly with what I do today or tomorrow. But nevertheless, it's very important. What are the general traits of character that I want to develop in myself? What kind of person should I strive to be? The second question is really a question about action. What should I do? There are lots of times when we look to ethics for real guidance. I'm facing a certain problem. What should I do about it? That's different from the general question of what kind of person I ought to be. Maybe I have a clear idea about that. Maybe I don't. But I find myself in an ethical dilemma, and I think, wait a minute, what should I do in this kind of case? And it might not be very clear to me. So I look to an ethical theory for some kind of guidance. And then finally, there's the question, how should I decide? How, in general, do I go about making decisions? How do I decide what to do? Now, one thing, those sound like very closely related questions, but I might simply say, well, here's what you do. Do this and don't do that. Lots of traditional ethical theories will give you a series of don'ts, for example. Like, thou shalt not, what? Good, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, and so on. Okay, and an ethical theory might take that sort of form. That pertains to action. It says these kinds of actions are impermissible. But how should I decide is a somewhat different question. That's a matter of how I go about deciding. How I know, for example, if those things are impermissible. How I decide in general what I ought to do and what I shouldn't do. That's a question about decision. Now, Confucius has 3 different labels for those. The question of character is discussed under his heading of Ren. Some older transliterations have J-E-N, Jen, and which is a more accurate pronunciation. Depends on the region of China. Really, it's somewhere in between, if you think. That's the concept of general, character, of virtue, what the kind of person I ought to be. I should be a person of Ren. The second sort of account is something that he puts under the label Li, which is propriety. It's really having to do with action. What are the kinds of action that are appropriate or inappropriate in a given context? And finally then, the question of decision. How does a virtuous person decide? How should I in general approach questions of decision and action? What method should I use? And his term for that is Yi. That is usually translated as righteousness, sometimes as justice. But I think it really has to do with doing the right thing for the right reason. And acting for the right reason, making your decision in the right way. Well, Confucius's view is that these are all important questions, and they are all independent. Most Western philosophers have tried to take one of them as basic and define the others in terms of it. So, for example, ancient philosophers in Greece generally took the question of character as basic. What kind of person should I be? And then, when they approached questions of decision and action, they said, well, the answer to that is easy. How should I decide what to do? I should decide in the way a virtuous person would decide. What should I do? Well, I should do what a virtuous person would do. Now, there's a sort of problem with approaching it that way. Can you see what it is? Yeah. Excellent. How do I know what a virtuous person would do? Right? I'm facing this problem, and I'm trying to decide what to do, and you say, well, act as a virtuous person would act. Decide in the way that they would decide. And I want to know, yeah, but what's that, right? And so often people criticize virtue ethics, which is what it's called when you put that question of character first, and define the others in terms of it. The problem is that, well, I don't know what a virtuous person would do. That's my problem. And so that can look like it doesn't really give you much guidance. A lot of modern philosophers take questions of action or decision as basic. They'll say, here are the actions that are right, here are the actions that are wrong. What kind of person should I be? That sort of person who does right actions and not wrong actions. And so that seems easy. How should I decide? Well, in the way that reliably leads me to do the right thing. Or if I take decision as basic, then a virtuous person is one who decides in that way. And a right action is one that results from that process of decision. So we're going to look at theories that have that general form. But Confucius thinks they're all different questions. They're related in some sort of way, but you can't define one in terms of the other. There have to be 3 different parts to an ethical theory. You have to have a theory of character. You have to have a theory of action. You have to have a theory of decision. Now, if that's right, then we really need 3 different parts of our ethical theory. One part is going to be a theory of virtue. It will answer that question, what kind of person should I be? Now, if you think about that, it's a kind of bewildering question. There are lots and lots of things that are good traits of character. And so it's going to have to tell us something informative about what it is to be a good person. The second part of an ethical theory will be a set of principles about what to do and what not to do. And a lot of ethics looks like that. We've already mentioned the thou shalt not, right? There are also positive things like keep your promises or honor your parents. Those are things that are common parts of an ethical theory. And really, insofar as we list ethical principles or rules, we're giving you a theory of action. And then the last thing is a theory of decisions. Or you might approach it this way, a theory of reasons. Why does a right person act? Well, they act for the right kind of reason, and here's what it is to act for the right kind of reason. So often this has the form of doing the right thing for the sake of doing the right thing. That is to say, acting in the right way because it's right. But some people have pointed out that actually it might be better to say, not so much because it's right, but because of the reason that makes it right. For example, why am I doing that? To keep my promise, let's say. And I don't necessarily have to consciously think, oh, and that's the right thing to do. I'm doing it for the reason, keeping my promise, which is the thing that makes it the right thing to do. So in any case, those three parts, a theory of character or of virtue, a theory of action, what to do and what not to do, and then finally a question of how to decide, what reasons to consider when you're reaching a decision, all of those are important parts of ethics, and none of them reduce to others. So that leads Confucius to a number of key concepts. Three of them we've already talked about. Ren, the idea of virtue. Okay, that's going to be the key answer to what kind of person I ought to be. I should be a person of Ren, a person of virtue. Then there's going to be the question of propriety. That's what I ought to do, what I ought not to do. There's the question of yi, righteousness or justice. What reasons I ought to use in acting, how I should go about making a decision, how I decide, why I do various things. And then there are two other concepts that are really central to him. One is under the general heading of propriety. He has the concept of zhong, which means altruism or likening to oneself. It has to do with reciprocity. The idea is really in acting ethically, I think about you much as I would think about myself. I recognize you as a fellow moral agent. And that idea of being able to put myself in your shoes, think about things from your point of view, is crucial to ethical thinking. And it leads him to a basic principle that I think you'll recognize. And then finally, the concept of the Tao. Later we're going to talk about Taoism, where the concept of the Tao is really a highly metaphysical concept. But here it's not. The Tao is just the path, the right way to live. And so when he talks about the Tao, it's really just living well, doing the right thing. The person who follows the path is the person who is doing the right thing, following the rules of propriety, and so getting right the question of what he or she ought to do. Now, there's something interesting. A lot of people would say there's a fourth part that has to be supplied for any ethical theory, and that is some sort of theory of human nature. You might think, look, what kind of person I ought to be really depends on the question of what it is to be a human being. What kind of thing or being am I, really? And only if I have a theory of what it is to be human, of what human nature is like, can I tell you what it is to be a good human being. We're going to look at a number of philosophers who have that sort of view, and there are a lot of philosophers we're not going to look at who famously have this sort of view. Thomas Hobbes, for example, argues in favor of government on the ground that without government, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And he has an idea about really what kind of human beings we are that leads to that. If we were left on our own, to our own devices, we would be very cruel to each other. We would be mean, it would be a war of all against all, he says. Other philosophers say, no, that's not true. People aren't naturally selfish and vicious in that sort of way. And a different theory of human nature leads them to different conclusions. Now, what's interesting about Confucius is that he thinks he can gain his theory without any approach to human nature. Now, why? Well, it looks as if it should be crucial. He is a humanist, and so all of value, all of ethics depends on human beings. This is not something that is coming to us from some other realm. It is not something that depends on something hidden. It really does relate from human relationships, the way in which we interact with one another. So here in the Analects, these things that are written down by his students, Confucius himself doesn't write anything, but we have the recorded sayings of Confucius. And often one that involves dialogues between Confucius and various students. So here is Qi Lu, one of his students. Qi Lu asked about serving the spirits. The master said, if you can't serve men, how can you serve spirits? Qi Lu added, I venture to ask about death. Confucius answered, if you don't know about life, how can you know about death? So he tries to keep his ethical theory focused on this world, on the things of this world, and is arising out of the things that happen right in front of us. This is one of the signs of his empiricism, by the way. He says, no, this is not something that comes from some metaphysical insight or spiritual revelation. This is something that we can discern just on the basis of our experience of human beings. He says the value of the way, that's the Tao, remember, the value of the way depends on man. The value of man does not depend on the way. So we define the right way to live in terms of human beings and their relationships to one another. But now this is supposed to be independent of any particular theory. And indeed, he says, well, yeah, nothing about human nature. Zikong here says, we may hear the master on letters and culture, but we may not hear him on human nature and the way of heaven. So in short, ask Confucius about the ways of heaven, and he is not going to be willing to commit himself to anything. Ask him about human nature, what underlies experience, the real nature that we have that makes us behave in certain ways, and he gives no theory. Now I think he does that because he thinks the conclusions he reaches do not depend on any particular approach to human nature. So he talks about the things we can affect, our behavior, our character. He does not talk about the things we can't affect, our underlying nature. Well, now, a lot of Confucians in this tradition have thought there's no way to do this, okay? What constitutes good rules for action, they have thought, really depends on what human beings are like. And so we've got a variety of views in the Confucian tradition. A lot of people have seen this as a blank that has to be filled in some way to make Confucian theory make sense. So Mencius, maybe the most orthodox interpreter of Confucius, the most influential, says people are naturally good. It's not to say people don't do bad things, they do, but our nature is basically good. Left to ourselves, we would tend to act well. We would tend to do the right thing. Other things can interfere. So think about something that falls if you drop it. Things can interfere with that, but nevertheless, if nothing impedes it, it's going to fall. So similarly, he says, human nature will tend in a good direction unless something gets in the way. Xunzi has exactly the opposite view. People are naturally evil. Indeed, his most famous work is called That the Nature is Evil, and he means the nature of human beings. And he argues again and again, paragraph after paragraph, that people are naturally evil. Again, not to say we can't be taught to do good things, but that's the result of teaching, the result of training. It is not the result of our natures. Now, other people have tried to reconcile these views. So Wang Cheng, for example, an empiricist, very explicitly says, look, they're both right. Some people are good, some people are bad. Okay, so some people have a good nature, some people have a bad nature. My daughter teaches kindergartners, among other elementary school teachers, and she will sometimes say, there are kids who enter kindergarten and are just good kids. They're sweet, they tend naturally to do the right thing. There are other kids that seem naturally bad, and she thinks, you're going to do great things, and you're headed for prison. And anyway, now it may have to do with nurture up to that point, of course, but it may also be that some people have a nature that's quite different from other people. And then in the Neo-Confucian medieval period, Zhu Xi comes up with a different account, which is maybe the most influential today in Confucianism. And it really says we have both good and evil tendencies within us. That is to say, it's not that everybody is naturally good, not that everybody is naturally evil, not that some are one way and some are the other. It's really that every single one of us has good and evil fighting within us. So every one of us has a natural tendency toward the good and a natural tendency toward the bad. We are naturally selfish and we are naturally concerned with other people. They're both parts of our nature, and so our nature really has a conflict built inside it. And Zhu Xi, as I mentioned, is maybe now the most influential ever since people within the Confucian tradition have tended to say, maybe that's why the master didn't give us any account of human nature, because if that's right, then in a sense, there's nothing to say about that except that, well, it's up to us to resolve those conflicts. Let's talk a little bit more about Mencius, since for many, many centuries, he really is the most influential interpreter of Confucius. He gives us an account that is, I think, extremely interesting in its own right. It is, in my view, somewhat different from Confucius's own view. But nevertheless, it's something with a real power, and it's something that we're going to come back to in various ways in other parts of the course. He thinks that virtue is innate. It is based on feelings. Now, a lot of empiricists think of our minds as blank slates, that nothing is really innate to us. But actually, even the most rigorous empiricist thinks that the mind isn't really just completely blank. It does have certain abilities, certain tendencies. And Mencius thinks that virtue is one of those things that is innate. It is born inside us. It isn't coming from experience, in other words, or at least the things that are part of our nature on which it is founded are not things that come from experience. So he says, for example, all men, and he means here all human beings, have a mind which cannot bear to see the sufferings of others. So everybody recoils naturally from seeing someone else suffer. Now, he has an argument for this. He said, if people suddenly see a child about to fall into a well, they will without exception experience a feeling of alarm and distress. Imagine that, I don't know, Labor Day has just gone by. Imagine that you're at a family gathering with a barbecue, and there's a toddler roaming around, and it turns out there's a well somewhere on the side there, and it's one of those old-fashioned wells, and you see the toddler start to climb over the little thing and go down into the well, right? And so the toddler is there and starts climbing up, and you think, oh my gosh, what are you going to do? What would your reaction be? Okay, you might cry out, get somebody to help. What else might you do? Call the police? Well, if the baby's already down in the well, yes. But I mean, if they're just wandering toward it or starting to climb up, where they might fall, it's probably not a good idea to call the police and say, I think a baby is about to fall into a well. Okay, you're going to be here in 10 minutes? Awesome. Isn't anybody going to get up and run and get the baby, keep them from falling into the well? Okay, Mencius thinks that's what everybody would do. Maybe you refute Mencius by not having that reaction. But anyway, that's, he thinks, the way people would react. They're naturally going to try to prevent that. Now, you could be in a setting maybe where people say, baby about to fall into the well. But there's something really weird about that setting. I don't know if you've had this reaction. I'm sometimes struck by photographs of, let's say, starving children or animals that are dying, where the photographer clearly could do something to help, right? Or the people who see somebody injured, and rather than doing something to help them, watch them bleed to death and film it on their cell phones. There was a recent case like that where somebody was hurt, and they really did bleed to death while people were filming this on their cell phones. Nobody went over and applied pressure to the wound or tried to save them. Now, Mencius would think, look, that doesn't refute my view, but it says something is really interfering with our natures, okay? It is a natural human reaction to try to rush over and either prevent harm, as with the baby in the well, or to try to help the person who is injured. It should upset us to see this, and the right reaction is to do something to help. So he says, action, yes, some things can interfere with that. We don't always do the right thing. But on the other hand, he said, certain feelings really are innate to us. The feeling of commiseration. In other words, being able to put ourselves in that person's place enough that if they're suffering or in danger, we feel that within ourselves and we're drawn toward helping. Or the feeling of shame or dislike, the feeling of modesty, the feeling of approval or disapproval. All of those feelings, he thinks, really are innate in us. And those are things that lead us then to certain kinds of traits of character, at least if nothing interferes. So that feeling of commiseration, of pity, of empathy, being able to put myself in the other person's place, that is going to lead me to be virtuous. That is going to lead me toward what Confucius calls reciprocity, I'll be able to put myself in your shoes and think about it from your point of view. And that's important in a lot of our ethical behavior. The second thing, shame and dislike, that is going to lead us toward doing the right thing for the right reason. We will feel ashamed of doing the wrong thing. We will dislike things that are immoral, that offend these basic innate emotions, and so that's going to push us toward acting for the right reason. Modesty, that is going to lead us to propriety, to doing the right thing. We're going to care about what's the right thing in a situation, about what's appropriate and inappropriate behavior, because we're modest, we don't want to stand out, and we're also complacent. That is to say, we want to get along with others, we don't want to cause trouble, and so that's going to be naturally something that leads us in the direction of following the rules. And then finally, approving and disapproving, that's going to be something that underlies moral knowledge. Give me an example of something that's really immoral, something that's an outrageous example of immorality.
Holocaust.
The Holocaust. Okay, good. Well, not good, but right, that's a good example of something that is morally terrible. Now, how do you know it? What underlies your knowledge that it's a terrible, terrible thing? Well, Mencius would say it's the fact that it arouses these feelings inside you. You imagine people being led to the slaughter in this sort of way, and you recoil at it. There's something in you that recognizes there's something horribly wrong. And it can help not to think about the numbers, 6 million people murdered, but instead to think about it in more individual terms. In fact, there's a book about the Holocaust that's simply entitled 1 + 1 + 1. And the central point is you don't understand the Holocaust if you just look at the statistics. If you just think about the numbers, you have to realize it's not 6 million. It's 1 + 1 + 1, and so on, 6 million times. And you start thinking about that, and it should provoke certain emotional reactions in you. Ones of disapproval, yes, of fear, maybe, of terror, of horror, of pity. All of those things are natural reactions to that kind of outrageous immorality. Now, let's try to cheer up. Give me an example of something that is unquestionably, uncontroversially, morally good. Yeah?
Doctors Without Borders.
Doctors Without Borders. Okay, good. Doctors who travel to countries and help impoverished people who are otherwise unable to obtain medical care. They're not doing with these doctors for any kind of remuneration on their part. It's something entirely charitable. You might think, wow, okay, that's unequivocally a good thing. And now, how do you know that? Mencius would say, because you have an immediate reaction. There are people in need, someone who goes out of their way, does not benefit in any way by helping them. That's something that seems unequivocally good. It leads to feelings of approval, of liking that thing, of recognizing the commiseration, the compassion that people have in doing that. Now, here is one of my favorite passages. In fact, it appears in the book of Mencius and also in a Confucian book known as the Doctrine of the Mean. The man who would be benevolent, that is to say virtuous, a person of ren, is like the archer. The archer adjusts himself and then shoots. If he misses, he does not murmur against those who surpass himself. He simply turns around and seeks for the cause of error within himself. Now, I don't know how many of you actually, are archers or have shot a gun or played Pokemon and, try to catch a Raikou or what have you. But all of those things apply to this, right? And Mencius and Confucius are saying, look, when you miss the mark, when you don't succeed, look for the cause of error within yourself. That's what the virtuous person does. The virtuous person doesn't blame others, doesn't say, there was a sudden gust of wind, or, gosh, there must be something wrong with this bow and arrow, or this gun, or, my cell phone, or the server, or something like that, but instead looks for the cause of error within themselves. And here is, I think, some of the most beautiful aphorisms in Mencius. He said, the path of duty lies in what is near. Men seek for it in what is remote. The work of duty lies in what's easy, but people seek for it in what is difficult. So in other words, he's saying, look, it is easy to be a good person. It's near to you. In fact, the great man is he who does not lose his child's heart. The great end of learning, Mencius said, is nothing else than to seek for the lost mind. Now, what on earth is he saying? Really, that you already know what right and wrong are. You already know what you should do and what you shouldn't do. And all you have to do is keep that clear. Keep that focus on the child's heart. You know as a small child, for example, that it's wrong to break a promise, that it's wrong to lie, that it's wrong to hurt somebody else. You know it's good to help somebody else in need. And those are things that are really built into you. Don't lose that child's heart. Go back and rediscover that. Later in life, it can seem like all of that is complicated, all that's difficult. But Mencius says, really, it isn't very difficult at all. There's a book that was popular maybe, 20 years ago? Everything I learned, or everything I know I learned in kindergarten, or something like that. And it was about ethical knowledge. It basically said, look, the kindergartner already knows what right and wrong are. And all you have to do is go back and recover that basic knowledge that you already have about right and wrong. And your feelings of shame, of guilt, of pleasure and displeasure are already going to be the signals to you that you know this. All you have to do is keep the window clean and keep yourself away from interfering factors. You already know what right and wrong are. Now, I mentioned that Xunzi has exactly the opposite view. Xunzi, writing about 200 years after Confucius, says, look, it's exactly the opposite. The nature of man is evil. The good, which our nature shows, or our behavior shows, is factitious. It is artificial. It is the result of training, of artifice. It is not natural to us. So, there are real questions that you encounter in looking around the world at what's natural and what's artificial. I don't know if you've ever watched Josh Gates, the explorer, on one of his TV shows, Exploration Unknown, things like that, where he goes and finds a formation. The question is, well, is this a natural rock formation, for example, or is this a sign of an ancient civilization? Is this the result of artifice? And in that kind of context, people look for straight lines, they look for right angles, and so forth. Well, here, we look for different things to determine what's the result of artifice, what's the result of cultivation, of conscious effort, and what's purely natural in ourselves is a harder question. But he thinks we can discover it because he says, look, we are in fact all concerned with ourselves. We are naturally selfish. And it's a good thing we are. We need to be selfish to survive. I need to think about getting something to eat, for example, or getting something to drink. I need to be concerned with my own shelter, with my own welfare. If I'm not at all concerned with that, I'm going to die. And so there is something that nature has built into us, this concern for self, a desire for gain, envy of others, even dislike of others. All of those things are pretty natural to us. And in fact, what we have to develop is a way of controlling all of them. So he says, we aren't born practicing self-denial. How many babies do you know who practice self-denial? Right? Actually, Augustine in the Confession says, look, I was an evil, wicked, sinful baby. He said, I don't remember it, but I know what babies are like. What are babies like? You know, like, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I'm cold, I'm hot, I pooped my pants. Okay? Baby, it's all me, right? From a baby. That's what's natural to us, and we have to learn to care about other people. So he says, we aren't naturally people who engage in self-denial. We don't naturally yield to other people. We don't naturally have faith in other people. We aren't naturally people who obey rules that concern the welfare of others. Our nature is really to be selfish, and we have to be taught to care about other people. And so Xunzi has this view that ethics is really about the contrast between the individual and the rest of society. And really it's a question of controlling the individual for the good of the whole group. A lot of people think of ethics that way. And he thinks that's naturally going to follow if you think, look, we're naturally, of course, concerned with ourselves. We have to be taught to care about other people and care about the welfare of the group. So he says the nature of man being evil must be submitted to teachers and laws, and only then can it become correct. Well, he does think we have the capacity to be virtuous. And here there is an important philosophical distinction that we have to observe. there's a difference between a capacity and a tendency. Okay, so he says we tend to be selfish, but we have the capacity to be ethical and to care about other people. What's the difference? Well, tendency, that's what you have a propensity to do, you tend to do. All other things being equal, that's going to be what you're going to do. But on the other hand, you have the capacity to do something else. So he would say, for example, people are naturally lazy, but they can develop the ability to work hard. That's something we have the capacity for. Think about a lot of things that result from training. What are some things that nobody can do naturally, but that do result from training, from practice, from education? Yeah?
Speaking a language.
Speaking a language, exactly. Speaking a language isn't something that just comes naturally. Put a baby in the woods and just say, don't let it hear any language. Let's see if it starts talking. It's not going to, right? I mean, that would be a horribly unethical experiment. I would hope that our board that approves these things would turn that down. But in any event, that's something that you have to learn by being around others. Yeah?
But didn't it have to come naturally to someone for it to have developed?
Ah, good. It may be that we have to have a natural capacity for language, and maybe even something stronger. Noam Chomsky famously argues that we actually have to have something like a universal grammar already in our heads. That's still a very controversial thesis in psycholinguistics. But yes, to learn to speak English, for example, that's something we have to be taught. It's not something that arises naturally. What are some other things that really require skill, training, effort, not something that you can do naturally? Yeah? Ride a bicycle, good. Riding a bicycle is not natural. You have to learn to ride a bicycle. Now, once you've learned it, it tends to stay with you. You can, not ride a bicycle for years and you still remember how to do it. But nevertheless, it isn't natural. You have to be taught. Other things like that. Yeah?
Learning how to drive a car?
Learning how to drive a car, exactly. You can't just put a baby in the car and say, all right, let's take me to Houston, right? I mean, with baby, you're going to be in trouble. And so that's not something that's natural. That's something that has to be learned. Yeah?
Shooting a bow and arrow.
Shooting a bow and arrow, yes. To take something very close to what Mencius had in mind, that is not something natural. That is something you have to learn to do. And it's something that requires a considerable amount of skill. Now, some people might have greater capacity for certain things than others. And so, it takes you a while to find out whether you really have much of a capacity for something or not, and how good you can become. Nevertheless, this is something that really, there are examples all over the place of things we have to be taught to do. Now, here's the importance of this for Xunzi. What is natural to us is not actually to be ethical. It is not virtue. Virtue is one of those things that has to be taught. So like speaking a language, like shooting a bow and arrow, or riding a bicycle, or driving a car, it's something that has to be learned. It requires training, it requires effort. And so that's something, he says, that is fundamental. How do you become good? Well, Mencius says, just recover your child's heart. Just clear your mind and go back to the knowledge you had even as a small child. Xunzi says, no. It requires self-control. It requires effort. It requires education. It requires training. It requires developing habits. It requires practice. It is not something that just happens naturally. Well, let's take a look, to close today out, at Confucius's theory of virtue, of Ren. The question of what kind of person I ought to be. And we'll save for next time the other two questions of ethics. What kind of person should I be? Well, a person who exhibits Ren, who exhibits virtue. But now what is that exactly? And here you've got a problem, in a sense, because if I stop and say, so what are some good traits of character? There are lots and lots of possibilities. In fact, let me give me some examples of things that you would look for in a friend, for example. What are some traits of character that you would want a friend to exhibit?
Generosity.
Honesty, good. What are some others? Loyalty. Others. Humor, good. What else? Compassion.
Generosity.
Generosity. Okay, good. Yeah.
Non-judgmental.
Being non-judgmental. Okay, yeah, being supportive as opposed to, constantly critical, yes.
Open-minded.
Being open-minded.
Respectful.
Respectful. Yeah.
Ambitious.
Ambitious. Yes. Okay, understanding. All of those are things. Oh, go ahead.
Genuine.
Genuine. Yeah, all of those things we would consider virtues, right? And we'd come up with others. If I think, you're going to hire somebody, what are some things that you specifically want in addition to those, let's say, in an employee? Intelligent.
Hardworking.
Hardworking.
Reliability.
Reliable. Good. Responsible. Excellent. What about a boss? You're thinking about taking a job. What are qualities in addition to any of those that you would think of looking for in a boss? Yeah.
Organized.
Organized.
Understanding.
Understanding. Exhibiting leadership. Compassionate. Okay, good. Now, in short, there are lots and lots of traits of character that we would look for in others and that we would try to develop in ourselves. In fact, once I gave myself a little test. I said, how many virtue terms like that can I write down in 45 minutes? Actually, I didn't set 45 minutes. I just gave up after 45 minutes because I had already typed out 247 virtue terms and had the sense I was getting nowhere near the end, right? And that was just in English. If you look at terms used in other languages for virtues, you find a lot of things that it's a little hard to translate in English. So in short, we have an extremely rich vocabulary about virtues, good traits of character, and it's hard to know where to begin, in other words, to give a theory of that. Confucius says, well, there are 5 that I'm picking out that I think together constitute perfect virtue. They are in some way central. If you have these, the others will tend to follow. And most virtue ethicists think that. They think, yes, there are hundreds, maybe even thousands of virtues, but they come organized in a certain way. And if you have some, then others are likely to follow. So they then give you an account of what are the really central virtues. And this is Confucius's account. So the virtuous person is serious, is generous, is sincere, is diligent, hardworking in other words, and is kind. Those, he says, are the really central virtues. Now, what it means for them to be central, how they relate to others, I think that's unclear, and it's a really good question to think about. But those are the ones that he takes as the most important. Now, there is one other claim he has about virtue that I think is extremely important for us to understand, and that is that on his account, virtue is a mean. In fact, one of the 4 books of Confucianism is called The Golden Mean, The Doctrine of the Mean, The Unwavering Pivot is how Ezra Pound translated it. But in any case, it argues for the thesis that virtue is a mean between extremes. So for example, well, gosh, let's take one of those virtues, like generosity. He says there are 2 ways of failing to be generous. What's the most obvious? Good, to be greedy, to be selfish, to be stingy. Okay, those things seem opposed to generosity. But he says there's another way of failing to be generous. Imagine that you go too far in the other direction. Okay? You're, as it were, too generous. What does that mean? What would that be like? Yeah, you become so selfless that actually you're not taking care of yourself. And Confucius would say that's a less common way of failing to be generous, but nevertheless, or at least let me say, it's another way of failing to be virtuous. It's as it were going overboard, being too much that way. So, here is how he thinks about those 5 central virtues of virtue. The person who isn't serious enough is frivolous, and that's bad. But the person who is too serious is somber. Okay? He wants you to take life seriously, but not so seriously that you are just somber all the time. Somebody comes in and tells you a joke, right? And you say, oh, but think of all the suffering in the world. How can I laugh at your joke? Right? I mean, here's one of my favorite jokes. It's admittedly extraordinarily stupid. Father comes down, sees his son at the breakfast table in the morning, eating a bowl of cereal, and says, you know, son, we haven't talked in a long time. What do you want to be when you grow up? Kid says, I want to be a vitamin. Father says, a vitamin? What do you mean you want to be a vitamin? It says right here in the box, vitamin B1. All right, good. You laugh, right? Now, I've been known to laugh for hours over that joke. But that's an example of being frivolous, maybe. You laugh a little bit. That's a sign of being appropriately serious. But suppose you say, oh, I can't laugh at that joke. There are people who are malnourished. There are children who are starving. How can you tell a joke about a child at the breakfast table when there are people who are hungry? That's that's going too far, right? Well, generosity. Yes, we've talked about stinginess. The other extreme of that is being profligate, he says. Suppose I see somebody begging on the street corner. They say, anything helps. And I say, here, keys to my car and house. They're yours. And I get home to my wife and I say, by the way, I just gave away our house and car. Hope you don't mind. We're going to live in the streets now. She would not consider that virtuous. Let's take a look at the next one. Sincerity. You could be insincere. That's what we would normally consider the opposite of sincerity. But you could also be too sincere. You could be reckless. Okay? You could actually be, as it were, too honest, too blunt. Examples of that. What's a case of somebody being too honest? Yeah.
Telling someone they're fat.
Okay, telling somebody they're fat. Yeah. They say, hey, I've lost a few pounds. How do I look? They say, fat. That's not virtuous. Laziness. Well, that's the opposite of diligence, working hard, but you can work too hard. You could be too diligent. That makes you dull. Oh, work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. Someone who is unkind is the opposite of kind, but there's another way of failing to be kind. Being just indulgent, spoiling your child, for example, going too far in a kind direction, doing things for too many people. But then finally we come to a really interesting question. Can you be too moral? And since we're out of time, we'll save that question for next time. Can you go too far with morality and virtue?